9:30 p.m. Atlas Bar, Cedar Falls, Oregon. Tuesday nights bled empty stools and bourbon-soaked confessions. Sophie West gripped her martini like armor, 47 missed calls blazing across her iPhone. Not one voice asking if she breathed okay. 2 seats down, Ethan Cole's weathered hands cradled whiskey. Faded flannel hung loose on tired shoulders. Work boots scarred by honest labor. He slid a $10 bill across mahogany, double his drink's worth. His phone shattered the silence. "Hey, sweetheart." Everything shifted. His voice melted into silk and safety. A father's sanctuary whispered through static. Something fractured behind Sophie's ribs. Raw longing. The exquisite torture of witnessing devotion she'd never known. When rain swallowed him whole, she sat paralyzed, studying her untouched glass. Tomorrow night, same bar stool, same hunger. She had to understand what made a stranger's tenderness feel like coming home. The morning after brought spreadsheets and board calls, but Sophie's mind wandered to calloused hands and gentle voices. Cedar Falls stretched like a painting outside her Pine Lodge window, population 8,000, where everyone knew everyone except the ghost-haunting room 12. She'd returned to this forgotten corner of Oregon for one reason: to finally clean out her father's house. Robert West had been gone 6 months now, and she'd managed to avoid this reckoning until the lawyers started calling about unpaid property taxes. Her sabbatical from West Tech AI was supposed to last 3 months. She'd already burned through 2 hiding in conference rooms and corporate retreats, anything to avoid coming home. Ethan Cole lived in a different Cedar Falls entirely. His universe revolved around Emma's morning violin practice and Henderson's lumber mill, where he shaped wood into something beautiful for $1,200 a month. The math never worked: $800 for rent, $300 for groceries, $200 for Emma's music lessons. But somehow they survived on love and creativity, building furniture from scraps and dreams from bedtime stories. Sarah had been gone 2.5 years now, cancer taking her in slow, cruel increments. Emma barely remembered her mother's face, but she knew Daddy's hands could fix anything broken, almost anything. Tonight felt different at Atlas Bar. Sophie had changed from her usual Armani into something softer cashmere that whispered money without screaming it. She ordered the same martini and claimed the same stool, watching steam rise from untouched olive brine. At 9:45, boots scraped against hardwood. Ethan appeared like clockwork, tired eyes scanning the room before settling on familiar territory. He noticed her immediately, probably wondering why the fancy lady had returned to their blue-collar sanctuary. Neither spoke for the first 10 minutes, content to exist in parallel loneliness. Then Emma called again. "Hey, sweetheart, what's wrong?" His voice transformed again, that miraculous softening Sophie had witnessed yesterday. She found herself leaning closer, hungry for vicarious tenderness. "Thunder keeping you awake? Remember what we practiced: count the seconds between lightning and sound. That tells you how far away the storm is." Emma's voice leaked through the speaker, high and worried. Sophie caught fragments. "Daddy and scared, and when are you coming home?" Ethan's response melted every defense Sophie had built in 33 years of boardroom warfare. "I'll be home in 20 minutes, baby girl. Put Mrs. Patterson on the phone so I can thank her for staying late." The call ended, but his smile lingered like sunrise after endless night. "Daughter?" Sophie ventured, her first words to him across 2 evenings of shared silence. Ethan nodded, pulling out his phone to show her a picture that stopped her breathing. Emma was 8 years old, with Sarah's blonde curls and Ethan's thoughtful eyes, holding a violin like it might save the world. "She's learning Pachelbel's canon," Ethan said, pride radiating from every syllable. "Takes lessons at Cedar Falls Music Academy, though I'm not sure how much longer we can afford it." Sophie studied the photo longer than necessary, seeing something achingly familiar in Emma's serious expression. "I used to play violin," she admitted. "My father encouraged it, said music taught discipline and beauty in equal measure. I quit when I went to college." The conversation flowed easier after that confession. Ethan talked about Emma's dreams of playing in an orchestra, how she practiced every morning before school in their tiny living room. Sophie found herself mentioning her father's workshop, though she couldn't explain why. "He worked with wood too," she said carefully. "Always said the right tools could create miracles." Ethan's eyes sharpened with interest, but before he could respond, Sophie's phone buzzed with another missed call from her assistant. The spell broke, reminding her of the gulf between their worlds. She excused herself, leaving $20 on the bar for a $7 martini she'd barely touched. But she'd written her first name on the napkin beside it, a breadcrumb trail for tomorrow's courage. Wednesday night arrived, dressed in expectation. Sophie had spent the day walking through her father's empty house, touching tools she didn't recognize and reading notebooks filled with sketches of furniture she'd never seen. Robert West's workshop smelled like cedar and abandonment, sawdust coating surfaces like grief. She'd found his journal in the bottom drawer of his workbench, pages chronicling the last 3 years of his life in careful handwriting. One entry stopped her cold. Sophie called today, but she sounded so tired I didn't mention the chest pains. My daughter works too hard, carries the whole world on her shoulders. I worry she's forgotten how to be happy. The date was 6 months and 2 days ago. He died the next morning. Ethan was waiting when she arrived at Atlas Bar, having claimed the stool beside her usual spot. I was hoping you'd come back, he said simply. Sophie slid into her seat, noticing he'd ordered her martini without being asked. The bartender, Mickey, according to his name tag, winked conspiratorially. Figured you might want to try something local, Ethan continued, gesturing to a second glass beside her martini. Oregon Pinot Noir, from a vineyard about 30 miles east. Emma and I went there last fall for their harvest festival. The wine tasted like liquid sunshine and autumn leaves, completely different from the corporate vintages she usually pretended to enjoy. It's perfect, she said, meaning it. Their conversation deepened as the evening progressed. Ethan told her about losing Sarah, how Emma had asked if Mommy was coming back from heaven for her birthday. Sophie found herself sharing fragments of her own grief, not about her father yet, that wound was too fresh, but about the loneliness of success. How building an empire sometimes meant forgetting to build a life. Emma asks about getting a new mommy sometimes, Ethan admitted, swirling whiskey in his glass. I tell her we're doing fine as a team, but honestly, sometimes I wonder if she needs more than just me. Sophie's heart clenched at his vulnerability. She needs someone who loves her the way you do, she said softly. That's rarer than you think. The evening ended with Sophie asking for Ethan's address, claiming she wanted to send Emma something from her travels. It was partially true. She did want to do something kind for the little girl, whose photograph had stirred something maternal in her corporate-hardened heart. But mostly, she needed to see how they lived, to understand what authentic happiness looked like in a world where money couldn't solve every problem. Ethan hesitated, clearly torn between gratitude and caution, before scribbling an address on a cocktail napkin. She'd love to meet you, he said finally. Fair warning though, she asks about 1,000,000 questions, and she'll probably want to play violin for you. Sophie smiled, the first genuine expression she'd worn in months. I'd like that very much. Thursday afternoon found Sophie standing on Ethan's porch with a violin case that had cost more than his monthly salary. She'd driven to Portland that morning, visiting the most exclusive music shop in the Pacific Northwest, determined to find an instrument worthy of Emma's dreams. The house was small, but immaculate, painted yellow with white trim and flower boxes that suggested someone cared deeply about making things beautiful on a budget. Emma answered the door like a tiny whirlwind, all blonde curls and excited chatter. Are you Daddy's friend from the bar? He said you used to play violin too. Do you want to hear me play? I've been practicing extra hard. Ethan appeared behind his daughter, flour dusting his hands and an apron tied around his waist. Sorry, he said, looking adorably flustered. I was making cookies for Emma's school fundraiser tomorrow. Come in, please. The house felt like a home in ways Sophie's penthouse never had photographs covering every surface. Emma's artwork magneted to the refrigerator, the lingering scent of vanilla and cinnamon. But it was Ethan's workshop corner that stopped Sophie's breath entirely. Tucked into what should have been a dining room was a collection of handcrafted furniture that belonged in galleries, not garage sales. A rocking chair with intricate Celtic knotwork. A bookshelf that seemed to grow from the floor like a wooden tree. And most beautiful of all, a baby's crib carved with delicate roses and vines. You made all this? Sophie asked, running her fingers along the crib's smooth railings. Emma bounced excitedly beside her. Daddy's the best woodmaker in the whole world. That crib was mine when I was a baby, but now it's for when I get a little sister someday. Ethan's cheeks reddened slightly. Emma has big plans for our family expansion, he said dryly. I keep telling her we need to find her a mom first, but she's convinced it works the other way around. Sophie laughed, charmed by both Emma's enthusiasm and Ethan's gentle humor. Your father taught you well, she said, studying the craftsmanship more closely. Something about the style nagged at her, familiar in ways she couldn't quite place. Emma dragged Sophie to the living room for an impromptu concert, her small hands confident on the violin's neck despite her youth. She played Amazing Grace with the kind of pure emotion that made adults weep in concert halls, then immediately launched into a spirited rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star that had Sophie clapping along. "That was extraordinary, Emma," Sophie said when the performance ended. "You have real talent." Emma beamed, then grew serious. "Daddy says we might have to stop lessons soon because money is tight, but I practice every day anyway because music makes people happy." The casual acceptance in her voice broke Sophie's heart. This child understood sacrifice in ways Sophie never had at 8 years old. When Sophie presented the new violin, Emma's reaction was everything she'd hoped for, and more. The little girl held the instrument like it was made of spun gold, testing its weight and running small fingers along its perfect finish. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Emma whispered. Ethan looked stunned, clearly calculating the violin's cost and finding the number astronomical. "Sophie, I can't let you, this is too much," he began, but she cut him off with a gentle wave. "It's an investment in Emma's future," she said firmly. "Besides, I have a feeling this violin will be played by someone very special." Emma hugged Sophie fiercely, and for a moment, the successful CEO felt like she might have found something more valuable than any corporate acquisition. The afternoon stretched into evening, as Emma insisted on playing every song she knew on her new violin. Sophie found herself cooking dinner alongside Ethan, their movements surprisingly synchronized in the small kitchen. She couldn't remember the last time she'd chopped vegetables or stirred sauce, but something about the domestic rhythm felt natural, comforting. "You're different than I expected," Ethan said as they worked. "Different how?" Sophie asked, genuinely curious. "Warmer, more real. In that bar you looked like you were carrying the weight of the world. Here, you look happy." Sophie considered this, tasting the spaghetti sauce and adding more oregano. "Maybe I'm remembering how to be human again." Emma's bedtime routine was a masterpiece of paternal dedication. Ethan read 3 stories, sang 2 lullabies, and patiently answered Emma's endless questions about everything from why stars twinkle to whether her new violin friend Sophie would visit again soon. Sophie watched from the doorway, her heart breaking and healing simultaneously. This was what love looked like, not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but showing up every single day with patience and tenderness. When Emma finally fell asleep, clutching her new violin case like a teddy bear, Sophie felt tears threatening for the first time in years. "She's lucky to have you," she told Ethan as they returned to the living room. "I'm the lucky one," he replied simply. They talked until nearly midnight, sharing stories and dreams over cups of coffee that grew cold while they spoke. Sophie found herself telling Ethan about her company, about the pressure of being responsible for 500 employees and millions in revenue. "Sometimes I wonder if I built something meaningful, or just something profitable," she admitted. Ethan listened without judgment, then shared his own fears about raising Emma alone, about whether he was enough to help her reach her potential. "You're enough," Sophie said with conviction. "You're everything." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to examine. When Sophie finally left, Ethan walked her to her car, and she almost kissed him goodnight. Instead, she drove back to Pine Lodge with her heart full of possibilities she'd forgotten existed. Friday morning brought revelations that shattered Sophie's newfound peace. She'd been cleaning out her father's bedroom when she found a photograph tucked inside his Bible, Emma, at what looked like a birthday party, chocolate cake smeared on her bright smile, sitting beside a man whose back was to the camera. On the reverse, her father's handwriting, Emma's 7th birthday. "She's as bright as Sophie was at that age. Ethan is a good man, reminds me of myself at his age, all heart and integrity." Sophie's hands shook as the implications hit her. Her father had known Ethan and Emma personally, known them well enough to attend birthday parties and keep photographs. The workshop yielded more clues. Tucked between pages of Robert West's journal were sketches of furniture pieces Sophie recognized from Ethan's house, the rocking chair, the bookshelf, detailed drawings with measurements and notes in her father's careful script. One entry made her blood run cold. "Taught Ethan the dovetail joint today. His hands are steady, patient. Reminds me why I love this work. He's making a desk for Emma, wants it to be perfect for when she starts serious homework. I'm proud to pass along what I know to someone who understands that good wood carries the maker's soul." The date was 18 months ago. Her father had been teaching Ethan woodworking while Sophie built her empire, too busy to visit home. Sophie drove to Ethan's house in a fog of guilt and confusion, the photographs clutched in her trembling hands. She found him in his backyard workshop, sanding what looked like a child's desk with the same careful attention to detail she'd seen in her father's pieces. Emma sat nearby, practicing violin scales with fierce concentration. The scene was so perfect, so domestic and loving, that Sophie almost turned around and drove away. But she needed answers, needed to understand how her father had been part of their lives while remaining a stranger to hers. "Ethan," she called softly, not wanting to startle him while he worked. He looked up, smile fading when he saw her expression. "We need to talk." Emma hugged Sophie hello with the enthusiasm of a child who'd already decided they were friends. "Look at my new desk, Sophie. Daddy's making it just for me, with a special place for my music books and everything." The desk was beautiful, crafted with the same skill and love Sophie had seen in her father's workshop. But it was the design that stopped her heart, identical to sketches she'd found in Robert West's journal, down to the curved legs and hand-carved music notes along the edges. "It's lovely, sweetheart," Sophie managed, her voice barely steady. "Emma, why don't you go practice inside for a few minutes? I need to talk to your daddy about grown-up things." Emma skipped away obligingly, leaving Sophie and Ethan alone with the weight of unspoken truths. "You knew my father," Sophie said without preamble, holding up the photograph of Emma's birthday party. Ethan's face went white, the sanding block slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers. "You're Sophie," he whispered. Not a question, but a statement of dawning horror. Robert's Sophie. The daughter he was so proud of, the one who was too busy conquering the world to come home. Sophie felt like she'd been slapped, the casual cruelty of his words landing with devastating accuracy. "He never told me about you," she said defensively. "Never mentioned teaching anyone woodworking, never said anything about Emma or—" "Because he didn't want to burden you," Ethan interrupted, his voice gaining strength and anger. "Because he knew you had important things to do, important people to impress." The fight that followed was inevitable, 2 years of grief and guilt, and missed opportunities exploding between them like shrapnel. Sophie accused Ethan of keeping secrets, of manipulating her emotions when he knew exactly who she was. Ethan accused her of abandoning her father, of being too self-important to notice an old man dying of loneliness. "He talked about you every day," Ethan shouted, his usual gentle demeanor cracking under the strain. "Worried about you working too hard, wondered if you were eating enough, if you were happy. And where were you? Building your empire while he built furniture for other people's children because his own daughter was too busy to visit." Sophie reeled as if he'd struck her, because every word was true and cutting and deserved. Emma's tears ended the argument abruptly. She stood in the doorway clutching her violin, eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Why are you fighting?" she asked in a small voice. "Are you going away like Mommy did?" Ethan immediately knelt beside his daughter, gathering her into his arms with practiced comfort. "No, baby girl, I'm not going anywhere. Sophie and I just had a disagreement about something grown up and complicated." Emma looked at Sophie with reproachful eyes. "Daddy doesn't yell, ever. You made him sad." The accusation hit harder than any of Ethan's angry words, because it came from a child's perfect moral clarity. Sophie had indeed made him sad, made them both sad, by bringing her family's dysfunction into their peaceful world. Sophie left without another word, driving aimlessly through Cedar Falls until she found herself at Riverside Cemetery. Her father's grave was simple, marked only with his name and dates, surrounded by flowers that were clearly tended by someone who cared. She sat in the damp grass, finally allowing herself to cry for everything she'd lost and thrown away. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she whispered to the headstone. "I'm sorry I wasn't here, sorry I didn't know about Ethan and Emma, sorry I built a life so big it couldn't fit you in it." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of cedar and sawdust that reminded her of childhood visits to his workshop, back when she'd been young enough to think her father was the most important man in the world. Saturday brought a phone call that would change everything. Sophie was packing her suitcase, preparing to return to San Francisco and her corporate life, when her father's lawyer called with urgent news. "Miss West, I've been trying to reach you about your father's will. There's a provision we need to discuss immediately. He left specific instructions about his workshop and tools." Sophie listened in stunned silence as the lawyer explained that Robert West had bequeathed his entire woodworking operation to Ethan Cole, the most worthy student I've ever had, who understands that true craftsmanship comes from the heart. The will was dated just 2 weeks before her father's death, suggesting he'd known the end was coming and wanted to ensure his legacy lived on in capable hands. Armed with legal documents and a desperate need to make things right, Sophie drove to Ethan's house to find ambulances in the driveway and neighbors clustered on the sidewalk with worried faces. Emma had developed a high fever during the night, spiking to dangerous levels that sent Ethan racing to Cedar Falls General Hospital at 3 in the morning. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who watched Emma when Ethan worked late, met Sophie at the door with tears in her eyes. "He's been at the hospital for hours," she explained. "Won't leave her side, won't even call for help because he's too proud and too scared." Sophie didn't hesitate. She drove straight to the hospital, her corporate crisis management skills kicking in for the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls. She found Ethan in the pediatric ward, slumped in an uncomfortable chair beside Emma's bed, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Emma was unconscious, her small face flushed with fever, connected to monitors that beeped ominously in the sterile room. Ethan looked up when Sophie approached, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and fear. "She wouldn't stop shaking," he said brokenly. "The fever came out of nowhere, and I didn't know what to do." Sophie placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, cutting off his panicked rambling. "You did exactly right. You brought her here, you stayed with her. You're being the father she needs." She'd brought coffee and sandwiches from the hospital cafeteria, practical offerings that felt inadequate but necessary. The conversation that followed was quieter than their previous fight, marked by the gravity of Emma's illness and the exhaustion that had stripped away their defensive barriers. Sophie showed Ethan the will, explaining that his inheritance of Robert West's workshop was legitimate and legally binding. "He wanted you to have it," she said simply. "He knew you'd honor his work, carry it forward." Ethan stared at the documents with disbelief, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. "I can't accept this," he said finally. "It should be yours, you're his daughter." Sophie smiled sadly, watching Emma's chest rise and fall with each labored breath. "You were his student. That made you family too." Emma's recovery began slowly, her fever breaking just as dawn painted the hospital windows gold. Sophie had dozed fitfully in a chair beside Ethan, waking every time the monitors changed rhythm or Emma stirred restlessly. When the little girl finally opened her eyes and smiled weakly at her father, Sophie felt a relief so profound it made her dizzy. "Daddy," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse but unmistakably herself. "Is Sophie still here? I dreamed she was playing violin with angels." Sophie leaned forward, taking Emma's small hand in hers. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." The promise surprised her with its certainty somewhere during the long night. She'd decided to stay in Cedar Falls, to choose connection over conquest for the first time in her adult life. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of recovery and reconciliation. Sophie moved out of Pine Lodge and into her father's house, spending her time cleaning the workshop and learning to use tools she'd forgotten existed. Ethan taught her the basics of woodworking with patience that reminded her painfully of her father, guiding her hands through the motions of measuring and cutting and sanding until her palms developed their own calluses. Emma recovered her strength quickly, as children do, and appointed herself supervisor of their joint projects with the seriousness of someone who understood that important work was being done. The first piece they completed together was Emma's desk, using her father's original design and Ethan's skilled hands to create something that would last generations. Sophie contributed mostly enthusiasm and the occasional correctly placed dowel, but her presence transformed the work from craft into communion. "Your father would be proud," Ethan said as they applied the final coat of finish, the wood glowing like honey in the workshop's warm light. Sophie touched the surface with reverence, feeling connected to Robert West in ways she'd never managed while he was alive. "I think he orchestrated this somehow," she said softly. "Brought us together through Emma and wood and love." The West Foundation launched quietly on a Tuesday in November, 6 months after Sophie's first night at Atlas Bar. The foundation's mission was simple: provide free woodworking education to single parents, helping them develop marketable skills while processing grief and loss through the meditative act of creation. Ethan served as head instructor, teaching dovetail joints and mortise and tenon construction with the same patience he showed Emma during violin practice. Sophie handled fundraising and administration, discovering that her corporate skills translated beautifully to nonprofit work when applied with genuine passion. Their first student was Marcus, a recently widowed father of 2 who learned to channel his grief into rocking chairs and toy boxes that would comfort his children for decades to come. Emma thrived in her new expanded family, though they were careful never to use that word officially. She had violin lessons twice a week now, funded by the Foundation's music education program, and her practice sessions filled the workshop with melodies that made both adults smile involuntarily. Sophie had learned to braid hair and pack school lunches and read bedtime stories, domestic skills that felt more valuable than any MBA coursework. Ethan had learned to delegate workshop responsibilities and accept help with Emma's care, allowing someone else to share the beautiful burden of single parenthood. They weren't dating, exactly, but they were building something deeper than romance, a partnership based on shared values and complementary strengths. 6 months after that first night at Atlas Bar, Sophie found herself back on the same bar stool, but everything had changed. Ethan sat beside her now, no longer a stranger but a partner in crime and love and the daily miracle of raising Emma together. They came to Atlas Bar once a week, their version of date night, talking about the foundation's growth and Emma's latest achievements and the furniture orders that were starting to overwhelm their small workshop. Tonight felt special somehow, charged with possibility and unspoken understanding. "I have something for you," Ethan said, pulling a small wooden box from his jacket pocket. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a ring he'd carved himself from the wood of Robert West's original workbench. "It's not a proposal," Ethan said quickly, seeing Sophie's startled expression. "It's a promise. A commitment to what we're building together, not just us, but Emma, the foundation, this life we've created from grief and hope and really good wood." Sophie lifted the ring from its box, admiring the intricate Celtic knots Ethan had carved around the band. It was beautiful in its simplicity, meaningful in ways that diamonds could never match. "It's perfect," she said, sliding it onto her right-hand ring finger. "Just like everything else you've made for our family." The words slipped out naturally, without fanfare or apology, because that's what they'd become, a family built on choice rather than blood, stronger for having been consciously constructed. Emma's violin recital that spring was held in the workshop, surrounded by the tools and furniture that had brought them all together. She played Pachelbel's canon with the skill of someone twice her age, her small hands confident on strings that sang with pure emotion. Sophie and Ethan sat together in the front row, holding hands and fighting tears as their daughter, because Emma was truly theirs now, legally and emotionally performed for an audience that included Marcus and his children, Mrs. Patterson, Mickey from Atlas Bar, and a dozen other friends who'd been drawn into their orbit of love and craft and community. After the final note had faded, Emma curtsied formally and announced, "That was for Grandpa West, who's watching from heaven with Mommy." The workshop had grown beyond anything Robert West could have imagined, expanding into the empty lot next door and employing 6 full-time craftspeople who taught classes and filled custom orders for furniture that was shipped across the country. Sophie had found her calling in nonprofit management, using her business skills to secure grants and partnerships that kept the foundation running smoothly. Ethan had discovered he was a natural teacher, patient and encouraging with students who came carrying their own grief and hope in equal measure. Emma had appointed herself official greeter and quality control inspector, charming visitors and ensuring that every piece met the West family standard of excellence. They worked together like a symphony, each contributing their unique strengths to create something beautiful and lasting. On quiet Sunday mornings, when the workshop was closed and Emma was still sleeping, Sophie and Ethan would sit together among the tools and sawdust, drinking coffee and planning their next project. Sometimes they talked about expanding the foundation, or Emma's college plans, or the furniture orders that were backlogged for months. More often, they sat in comfortable silence, watching dust motes dance in the early sunlight and marveling silently at the strange alchemy that had transformed their individual loneliness into shared joy. Sophie had learned that success wasn't measured in stock prices or quarterly reports, but in the number of people whose lives were touched by love and craft and the patient work of building something that mattered. The workshop still smelled like cedar and sawdust, but now it also carried the scent of fresh coffee and Emma's violin rosin and the flowers Sophie brought in from the garden she'd planted behind her father's house. Robert West's photograph hung above the main workbench, surrounded by pictures of the families they'd helped and the furniture they'd created, and Emma at various ages, holding her violin like a talisman. Sometimes Sophie caught herself talking to the photograph, updating her father on Emma's progress or asking his advice about a particularly challenging joint. She liked to think he could hear her, that somewhere beyond the veil he was smiling at the family his workshop had created from 2 broken hearts and one extraordinary little girl who believed in the healing power of music. Home, Sophie had learned, wasn't a place you returned to, but something you built with people who saw your soul and loved you anyway. It wasn't the penthouse in San Francisco or even her father's house in Cedar Falls, but the space between Ethan's laugh and Emma's violin practice, the moment when calloused hands guided hers through the delicate work of creating something beautiful from raw wood and infinite patience. She'd traded her empire for a workshop, her corporate success for the quiet satisfaction of teaching Marcus how to sand with the grain, her loneliness for the daily miracle of being needed and cherished and home. The math had never worked better in her life.